Okay. Today I'm going to tell you about Protocols 1. So just to orient you on where we are so far, we talked about some of the stuff in utilities and some of the basic core. Today we're going to start getting into the protocols libraries. And there's three big things that are in Protocols 1. And so this is how I'm going to organize what I'm going to tell you about for the next hour and 15 minutes. One is job distribution, Rosetta scripts, and resource management. And so these all have a theme in that's trying to get a runs working. So it's not necessarily doing the simulations, but it's getting all the information into the protocol. So I'm going to start with job distribution. And so the challenges of job distribution are getting resources into and out of the protocol. So you could think of resources as being the input structure, if you're just doing a single input structure simulation, if you had parameters for a score function, or if you were using experimental constraints. So if you had chemical shift data, say you needed to get that in, that you could use that as part of your protocol. Or if you had protocol-specific constraints. So if you knew you needed to have this ligand docked into this receptor site, then perhaps you know something about where that is, and you could specify that ahead of time. So if you're running a protocol, you somehow need to get all this information into the computer. And complementary to that is that you have all these computational resources that are going to be doing the work. So if you're running it on a cluster, or you're doing simulations not just on your laptop, then trying to manage the input data that's getting it to the computational resources is a challenge, especially if you have heterogeneous resources, or you were trying to do this in an automated way. So some of the specific challenges is if you have a cluster of nodes, how do you get the data to each node to work? And then if you have reading and writing from some data stores or some disk, for instance. And then also if you have interactions with the user, say if you're running in, say, Foldit or some other way, which I'm not going to cover today, how would you collect the information from the user and then respond to the user with reasonable information? So these are sort of the high-level challenges, and we have some systems in Rosetta for dealing with these. So the simplest and probably the most basic one that you'll use, you've already used, is the JD2 job distributor. And this can actually get us quite far. So we're going to go into some amount of detail about how this works. And that way you'll understand what's going on behind the scenes. And also if you do need to adapt it for a specific purpose, then you'll sort of have an understanding of the library. Also, I think it's a well-engineered system. So it can give you another example of another place to look in Rosetta for examples of how code is written and used. So the basic idea is that you have some set of input structures, and these are put into the job distributor through an job inputter. So depending on where the structures come from, different job inputters will be used to load data into the job distributor. The job distributor then hands a fully constructed pose to a protocol, which is just a mover. And then the mover performs some action or some hierarchy of actions. So you could have one outside mover, which then performs lots of submovers, which then perform lots of submovers, and so on, and eventually comes up with some structure at the end of the day, which will be a pose. And then that's handed back to the job distributor, which is then written out with a job outputter to output structures. So along the way, there may be additional output that's outputted, but that's handled in the mover itself. The mover can ask the job distributor, what's the name of my pose? But that's just about it. All it's basically getting is the pose, one single pose at a time, and it gets a reference, not a const reference. So it can modify the pose, and the pose that ends up at the end is the one that's written out. For computational resources, the job distributor... What's that? Oh, yes.
So is it possible to go in cycles between the job distributor and the protocol?
So the only facility for cycling the protocol is that a single job or a single structure that comes in can be run multiple times through this. So it's not that it will be, there'll be independent trajectories. So it'll be initialized as it comes in with the same input pose that it started with. It's just that if you say you have a trajectory that's random, then it will behave slightly differently. So a common example is you'll start with a particular input structure and then run a stochastic simulation and end up with some optimized structure at the end. And this is done in parallel, so that way you could do it, say, 1,000 times, and you'd end up with 1,000 predictions, and then you may cluster them after the fact, not within the structure. So it's not going to take one structure and go through it multiple times. If you wanted to do that on a per structure basis, you could have sort of a looping mover inside of the protocol, which then could perform sub-steps multiple times. So it doesn't use the job distributor to sort of aggregate the data and then send it back out. It's just the simple architecture. Okay. On the cluster, since each pose is handed separately to a mover, then the job distributor has the ability to hand different nodes on the cluster an input pose and get the results back from the input pose independently of the other nodes. So this is somewhat called an embarrassingly parallel parallelization, where each independent node is doing essentially different computations, and only the information is being aggregated by the job distributor, so that way it can be output at the end. Yeah?
Just a quick question. Why do you have pose drawn on the arrow from job distributor to protocol?
I'm thinking of the pose as when we call the apply function, that the job distributor is calling the apply function, and so it's passing in the pose into the mover.
Okay, and what about the way out? What function is it calling there? What function is protocol? Is the mover calling to send the pose back to the job distributor?
So when the apply function is finished, then it since it was just a reference to the pose, then if it makes changes to the pose, then the pose that it made the changes to at the end of the day, or at the end of the apply function, will be modified. So in that sense, it's using the fact that it's a reference as a way of communicating a pose into the mover and then back out. Okay, so what this architecture looks like in slightly more C++ is there's this idea of an inner job, which is a class, and it has a constant access pointer to a pose. And it has this number of n structs. So this is how many times is this structure going to be simulated or passed into the mover. And it has an input tag. The job is an instance is a class, and it has a reference to an inner job, and it has which n struct am I. So the job is the primary unit that's being passed through the job distributor, is which n struct instance am I, and which inner job do I have. So this is the basic loop in when you say go mover, is it takes in, it does some initialization and sets up which jobs are known. And then while there are new jobs, it loads the pose from the job with the current job. And so it gets a pose, it calls the apply, and then once the pose is, or the apply function is done, then it writes the final pose out to the job outputter. Okay, so the input file formats that the JD2 currently recognizes are primarily these three types. So the PDB format is the file format associated with the protein databank. The silent file format is a Rosetta-specific format, and it's designed to use minimal space, and I'll go into more details in the next few slides. And then also reading and writing from a relational database. So this is useful for doing further structural analysis, and also if you want to manage your data through a relational database. And we'll have a whole session tomorrow on looking at relational databases, which will go into much more detail about how this is structured. Okay, so the PDB format, you've probably worked with PDB files, but perhaps you haven't looked deeply at what the file format contains. There is a specification for the PDB format online. It's well documented, and And so if you have a specific question about how it works. Some peculiarities about this file format is that it's a fixed width format. So each column in the file corresponds to a specific piece of information. So it's not like if you have a longer string that it can expand to fill some space. This can be good, but it's also somewhat limiting in some sense. Also, the PDB format is designed to encode biological information, both in the header information and also in how the numbering and such of the residues are done. So, for instance, to identify a specific residue, it's not just enough to know the residue, but you also have to know the chain in the insertion code. And we talked about this a bit the other day. The insertion codes, for instance, in antibody loops, help with the alignments. But this makes it we can't use the PDB identification inside of Rosetta because it's much better to have them sequential from 1 to the number of residues. So there's if the structure was read in from the PDB, then we populate a PDB info object that's attached to the pose, and there's conversion to go between the Rosetta numbering and the PDB numbering. But this is somewhat of a headache because every time that you're wanting to interact with the user and tell them about the structure, then you have to check to see am I a PDB, and then do I have to do this conversion? But this is the life we live. There is complex header information, and there's some facility to parse this, and it gets put into a PDB header data structure that's associated with the PDB info. So there's a wealth of scientific information about this, which conditions it was crystallized at, if it's symmetry data, which refinement package was used, if there's ligands, and all sorts of things. And we parse this to some extent, but I think in the future, getting better capability to parse the header information will be important. One limitation of the PDB format that I haven't talked about so far is that the format has changed over the years, and what we support of the PDB is not all of them, and it's not even the most up-to-date one. Although most of the structures in the protein data bank are relatively clean, there are some inconsistencies there, and so oftentimes it's good to run input structures through external cleanup scripts. And I imagine that there's labs that have specific ones. I have one, but I'm hesitant to put this there because I couldn't find the right one. But if you know that if you look at your structures and they look funny, on the wiki there are, if there isn't a place that describes these cleanup scripts, there ought to be. So ask on the developer list for this. Yes?
I do have a question about that. Is there like a Rosetta prepare PDB for simulation?
As far as I know, there should be, but if there is, I don't know about it. I know that there are some relatively fleshed out ones, but I don't think that there's a canonical one. But if you need this, I would recommend somebody championing this to make this happen. One particular troublesome part is that the names of the hydrogen atoms in the latest PDB format are different than the names of the hydrogen atoms that Rosetta uses. And since it doesn't recognize the hydrogen atoms, they'll strip all the hydrogen atoms off and Rosetta will replace them. So just be aware of this when you're reading in structures from the protein data bank. Okay, so the silent file format it was designed to use a minimal amount of space. It was ported from Rosetta++ by James Thompson, who was a graduate student in the Baker Lab a few years ago, and it's grown to become widely used from there. So the basic structure is that it has the energies and the identifier at the top, and then it has one row per residue, and it has a variety of formats to encode the residue information. So it has sort of a header line where it says the structure and the energies, and then it has a number of lines for the residues, and that can be encoded in binary in some sense. This, since it's Rosetta specific, different formats encode different levels of information, like say if it's an ideal structure, if the bond lengths and angles have been idealized, or if they're using the bond lengths and angles that have either been optimized with the Cartesian bonding term, or if they've been read in from a crystal structure, say. But depending on which level of information it's kept, if it's ideal or not, then serializing a pose, often using silent files is done. Okay, so just to get a picture of what the file format looks like, I don't know if you can totally see this, But at the top of the file, there's a sequence, this is the one-letter amino acid codes. And then it has the column names for the scores. And then this gets into the body of the file. So it has a score tag, and then these are the values for these score types. And at the end, it has the tag that it's defining. So a tag, in a sense, is an identifier for a structure within the silent file. And then there are a number of lines that have the internal degrees of freedom if it's a DOI structure, and then the tag. So one nice thing about this format is if you use grep, which Sam will talk about later this morning, then you can grep for all the structures, all the lines with a particular structure tag, and you'll just get the structures out of the silent file. One thing to note is that the sequence information isn't repeated. So it's assumed that all the structures within a silent file correspond to the same sequence. If this isn't the case, if you want to store multiple sequences in one silent file, then there's a silent preserve header flag that you would put on the command line, and then each structure it would reprint the header information with this.
Was this from one design run? I don't know.
Why would you use this?
No.
Where did this come from?
Let's say you did a design run and you rendered like 100 structures in 20 different designs. It wouldn't give the different sequence for each one by default?
Yeah, so you have to use the preserve header. This is a thing that can be frustrating. I apologize about that. That's just the way that it's done so far. So there are different versions of the silent files. Binary is protein and binary are probably the most common. Protein is what I just showed you, and binary compresses the coordinate information into a binary format, so it makes smaller structures. Protein float is used to encode less precision in each atomic coordinate, which can be used to reduce the space even further. And then there's RNA, which is specifically used for RNA structures and RNA binary. I imagine these should be integrated into like a generic one and not split out into a separate type. There's a score information which doesn't have any of the confirmation information, but just the score information. And then there's a format that stores the coordinate information on a per atom basis. So it's something similar to a PDB format. But in theory, this could be expanded. And there's an architecture for defining silent file formats and how when you say I want to use a silent file format, you would specify it on the command line with the in-file silent struct type or out-file silent struct type if you were doing the output. And then that is read by the silent file code to do the reading and writing. The database I/O, the way this works is in Rosetta there's support for relational databases, and the way that the input and output work is that there are a set of feature reporters, and each feature reporter is responsible for a set of tables. So for instance, the residue comp feature reporter is responsible for the confirmation of the residue. Say if you had hydrogen bond feature reporter, that would be responsible for a few tables associated with hydrogen bonds. And there's about 50 or so different feature reporters that we've made. The I/O, if you use it from the command line, uses a canned set of features that roughly corresponds to what the silent file format contains. So when you write out to a database, it's going to write out a set of tables with the information spread out through those tables. And then when you read it in, you read in from those tables to recreate the structure. I'll get into more details about how this architecture works tomorrow. There is an atom tree diff file format, but please don't use this. It's been deprecated. It's now preferable to use the database architecture because there's so many other uses for it. And the space difference is not that much. Okay, since we're making the slides available, I thought I would add this here. There's a file converter or format converter application that if you build all of the files, I think it's in my pilot apps now, but it should be in public. This, if you just run it with nothing, this is the help file that comes out. I found this useful as a way to convert from PDBs to silent files to databases, and so on. This application is extremely simple. All it does is define a mover that doesn't do a thing and just runs it through the job distributor. So it's using the input and output from the job distributor to do this file conversion. It's just all of this script does is give you a helpful message when you run it, and basically does nothing else. So you probably don't need to write this down, but because you can get the slides. But this is the general options, such as passing in the Rosetta database, general input flags that I think are commonly used. So in file path, this locates the structures, whether or not the hydrogen atoms should be optimized or if they're well placed to begin with. Ignore unrecognized residues is good if you don't have the ligand, or if you're doing a sweep across the protein databank, then there's plenty of things that aren't recognized by Rosetta and doesn't choke. You can just ignore the waters if that suits your fancy. And then general output. If you're doing some protocol that does some other output, you don't need to output the structures, then you can turn that off. This specifies this .0001, 0002, which you've probably seen when you write out the structures from the output. It's possible to change that or turn that off. You can, if you don't have the overwrite flag, then the job distributor will complain if there's an output file that's there. This is another way to specify the output paths. And this is the output prefix if, say, you wanted to put them into a specific directory under a specific name. And then whether or not it's output in the full atom, if it's, say, it was a centroid structure, which is a reduced atom file version of a pose.
What happens when you use ignore unrecognized res?
What happens?
Yeah.
If it's just like a ligand in space, then it's just ignored. If it's covalently in the middle of your structure, then you end up with a jump across there. So that's not probably what you want.
So it's as if those atoms didn't exist.
Yeah. There is a way to remember unrecognized res, and then it stores in the PDB info object a map of the coordinates of those atoms in case you want to say, am I near a place where there was something that wasn't recognized? So it doesn't turn it into a residue type, but at least you may know the atoms are there. Generally, if you're working on a molecule, you'll have the parameter information, and you'll want to model the ligand, or you can strip it out of the PDB to begin with. This is primarily useful when you're doing like a scan across the database for targets or for scaffolds, and you can't process individual structures in a manual way. So ideally, we would have a residue file, formats or residue types for all of the residues in the protein databank, and I think this is a noble goal, but we're not there yet. So I hope people are working on it, or it's going to happen soon. There's been some technical limitations, and I think those are starting to get resolved. So I think it's not impossible to ask to recognize all the ligands in the protein databank. I know Phoenix does this, so we can do it too. Okay. If you have PDB input and output, you can specify -s for just a single PDB file, or -l if you want to pass it in a file of PDBs. The file is each line in the file corresponds to a PDB file. It's relative to the in-file path. So the right way to do this is to just put without any path information in the -l file, and then use the in-file path to set the prefix. That way, if you have this list, you can move it to the cluster, or you can pass it to your collaborators, and they won't have your home directory path in this list file. It'll just be on the command line. And then you can either do PDB output or gzip PDB output, which is nice as well. It uses the IZ stream, which Andrew talked about before. Okay. Oh, I was going to mention one thing. I'm not sure this has come up before, and it's worth knowing. If you're passing in files on the command line, you can use the unique suffix. So if you just do -s, that's the only option that's called -s. But if you do in:\file:\s, then that's sort of like using a namespace. except in this case, if you don't use the namespace, it tries to find it automatically. These options are at least specified in src basic options _ rosetta.py, and there's a script that converts the Python description of the options into C++ code that's parsed throughout. You've probably encountered this to some extent, but I find that the most reliable place to look for options is in the actual option specification file. The documentation is somewhat reliable to get ideas of what to look for, but at least that's what is being parsed by Rosetta. For silent file, I won't go into this too much, but these are some of the flags that you should be aware of if you're going to be using silent files. And again, look at the slides if you need them. I just want to point out this is the silent print all score headers is the flag that I had mentioned before. For database, when you want to use a database, there's two different types. One is a SQLite database, which is just a file in the file system. And then there's a client-server database, such as MySQL or Postgres. For MySQL and Postgres, you need to specify connection information. So this is like if you're going to SSH into a computer, it's a similar sort of information of connecting to a database server. So this, you specify a host, a port, a password, host, the username, the password, and the port. And this you should be told by your administrator, or if you set it up, then you'll know what this information is. If you start using host databases, then this information should be straightforward. Then you specify the mode if you want to be MySQL or Postgres, and if you use these, then they take special libraries that are the backends that are provided by MySQL and Postgres, and you have to compile with an extras flag of MySQL or Postgres if you want it. SQLite support is built into Rosetta. Every time you run it, it's using SQLite. This is really good for testing purposes because we always have a database backend available, and it's a very small, library. In that case, you would just, rather than specifying the host, the username, the password, and the port, you just need to pass the file name of the database in. And to do the output, you have to specify, yes, I want database output. And for input, you just say you want input. And to say which structures you want, you specify a query. So this is a SQL query, which I'll tell you more about tomorrow. But the idea is that from the database, you specify a set of tags that you want to use as your input, and then it can figure out the rest of the data from that. Yes?
Where do these tags come from?
The tags, so when you write out the structure, if the structure came from somewhere, it would be like the PDB code or the beginning part of the file name if you had read it in. So you can specify the tags, but generally the structures, either you've made them de novo or they've come from somewhere else.
Right.
So these, depending on how the structure got made, these tags are there.
Okay, I'm just kidding, but this concretely, if you ran a Reliable, and you have 100 sequence, and you want, I think we've emailed back, you want just 20 out of them. Is this the right option?
Yeah, so you would say select star, which means select the tag from the structures, and then instead of saying where the tag equals this, you would just say order by score and then limit to 20. So you would take the best 20 structures as input.
Okay, so it's actually, this is actually a string of SQL.
Yeah, it's a text string that you put in quotes, and it's going to compile this into something that the database recognizes, query the database, and get back a data like a table, and then it's going to, or a set of tables, and then it's going to create the structures from there. Okay. So one important part about job distribution is what happens if you're in the middle of a mover and something terribly goes wrong. How does a job distributor supposed to proceed? Does it crash? And one of the facilities that we have in Rosetta is exception handling. So I'm going to go the next few slides into basic exception handling, what it is, and then where we like to use it in Rosetta. So consider that you're in a position where you test, are there any residues in my pose? Tatiana had this issue yesterday where she didn't pass an input structure in, and it was crashing when she was trying to refold the full tree. So if there was a test for are there 0 residues in the pose, then this would have triggered it. Not that you were supposed to do that, but when you write robust software, then sometimes it's good to check for the conditions that you need in order to make sure that it's been good input. So let's say you had done this check. Then you're saying, okay, I'm in a bad place because I have 0 residues in my structure. What should I do? So one thing you could do is do a utility exit. This is in the utility libraries, and that basically prints a message and then just quits gracefully from there. Instead, if it's one thing that can be done is to throw an exception. So this is the syntax. You go throw and then an object that derives from base exception. So in utility exen, there's a number of classes that are of different types of exceptions. So in this case, I'm using a message exception with the message that it's an empty pose. So what throw is going to do is, rather than continuing on exiting the program, it's going to take all of the things on the stack that are still defined and call the destructors on them if they're classes, or if they're just ints, just delete them, and unwind the stack. So we're here in this inside of this if statement, but perhaps we're inside of a function, which is inside of another function, which is inside of another function. It's basically going to just right where you are on the stack, just move up the stack until it finds a try-catch block. So a try-catch block, it looks like this. You have the word try with a curly brace, and then a closed curly brace, and then a catch, and you say, what type of exceptions am I going to catch? So message exception is derived from exen base, and so it's going to catch everything that derives from that. So it's going to, in particular, catch this exception. And so this is like a function call in that we are now having a variable that has a reference to this exception. And inside of this catch block, we're allowed to do whatever we want. So it's going to sort of teleport us up from deep inside of our code up to this catch block. And now we have to decide what to do. So perhaps the most straightforward thing to do is to print the error message, or if we now have some more information about the context of what's going on, we print the message and then exit gracefully. This is quite powerful, and it can do quite a bit, but it's in some ways dangerous. So it's important to recognize why we use them and what are the legitimate uses for them. So since it unwinds the stack and calls the destructors, it's possible to leave the code in a bad state. So like, for instance, in the middle of scoring, you could be halfway through a refold, and let's say there was an exception that was thrown, and now you throw yourself back up to a higher level, and it catches it, and you still have the pose there. It hasn't been destructed because the pose was handed into the level below it. But now you've got this pose that's halfway through a refold and in the middle of scoring, perhaps. Like, this isn't a pose where you were able to then go on and do anything with it. It's effectively broken in this current state. You've violated the abstraction of that the refold is going to take a structure and do something with it and leave it back into a nicely folded state. So it's sort of like you opened up the machine and pulled out the parts, and it's not in a good state, or it doesn't necessarily have to be. So it's challenging to make sure that code is exception safe. It's a noble goal and something that we haven't achieved yet in Rosetta. So in particular, it's unless you have a particularly good reason to know that you're not in a bad state, it's best to assume that if you've caught an exception, that things are dangerous. You could, if you try to go on from here, then there's a good chance that the simulation isn't going to make any more sense. So in that sense, the best thing to do is to simply append more information and exit more gracefully than you could have done before. So like, for instance, if you're deep in the middle of scoring, you may not have right there in that function what the name of the structure was, or other information about the simulation, like which end structure in or what. So if you throw an exception, then you can move up the stack, and perhaps at a higher level, it's clearer what was going on that caused the exception. So you could say, well, I was in the middle of refolding, I was in the middle of doing an ab initio protocol with this particular structure. Here, user, here is in broad strokes where the error occurred. So is this a bug? Is this a bad input, or whatever? This is particularly good, like Andrew mentioned yesterday, where the user is going to be malicious and send you bad input. So if you don't detect the bad input correctly to begin with, and you're deep inside and something goes wrong, then you want to be able to tell the user this input file was malformed. So in order to do that, you need to handle that at the very highest level. Okay, so another part that makes exceptions not the most desirable way to write code is that because there are exceptional circumstances, then the compiler isn't obligated to optimize them. And so oftentimes the code paths are not, the compiler doesn't try to make sure that it's the fastest possible thing to execute an exception. So in that case, if you're using them for generic code flow, then it's often slower than just using the standard other constructs in C++. A further problem with using exceptions is that since you jump from inside of one part of the code to somewhere else that's going to catch it, it makes the logic of the code much more complex. So what you should think of is when you're throwing the exception is that you've relinquished control and that somebody else is going to handle it from there. So you should try to make things as tidy as possible as you're throwing it, and then from that not expect to get the logic back. So please don't use exceptions to say exit a while loop that seems to have once you've found the thing that you want, exit the while loop with an exception and then try to get back into it. It's a more fancy version, but you can do things like you can do with gotos, which are probably not the best logic. Okay, so what are the legitimate uses of exceptions if they're somewhat risky and tricky to use and make things a little bit slower? So the first is that some third-party libraries that we use throw exceptions. So when you're writing to a database, the database, for instance, can throw an exception saying the disk is full, or there's a bottleneck, there's a deadlock in the database because all of the nodes are writing to it at once. So in that case, rather than having like an error code, it might throw back an exception which has more information about it, say an error message or information about which disk it was writing to or whatever it may be. So in that case, if you're interacting with a third-party library, then it's important to know what exceptions they're going to throw and handle them, in which case you can then exit, or if you know exactly what happened in the third-party library, maybe you want to retry connecting to the database. So interacting with third-party libraries is definitely a legitimate use for using exceptions. The second part, which I've been mentioning before, is to allow higher levels of the code to clarify the error and then exit. So this is if it's bad input and you're deep inside, that you want to go up to the level that's handling the user input and then exiting from there. One thing that can happen is in the job distributor is handling bad input or bad jobs. And in some sense, this is somewhat risky, but it's in some ways essential, because if you're running a job over all the PDB and there's an error, you still need to run it all over the PDB. You don't have time to fix the bug. There are bugs in Rosetta, and we do run into them. So there isn't. What should happen is it should detect the bad job, say in the beginning. But if you are in the middle of it and something does go wrong, you don't want to kill the job on the cluster if you don't necessarily have to. So although this is perhaps leaving the code in a bad state, if you more or less understand what's going on in your protocol, there is, and tell you about next, is how the job distributor has limited support for handling bad jobs and continuing on to the next one. As some people have been writing unit tests have seen, exception handling is a way that you can test for error conditions. So if you can try to trigger a bad behavior to test to make sure that you're going to handle it correctly, and then immediately catch it to say, this particular thing is going to throw an exception, and I can now catch it right away and then do a TS assert and say, yes, I've caught this exception appropriately, and now I'll move on. So in that case, exceptions are better than just doing utility exit, because in that case it would just exit the unit testing framework rather than allowing you to continue on to test the rest of it. Okay, since code can throw exceptions, every app must be written in a try-catch block. The reason for this is that if an exception is thrown and nothing catches it, it just pops off the stack, then to the user's perspective, it's in some ways worse than a seg fault. I'm not entirely sure why, but for whatever reason, it hangs your system and it just doesn't work right. So it's a habit to get into. When you write a main function, the first thing you should do is write a try-catch block around the inside of the main function. If you look in public apps, there's examples of how this is done, and there's sort of a standard way of catching the exception, writing out the error, and just exiting gracefully. So when you write an app, look in the examples, and please wrap all of your applications in try-catch blocks. Okay, so this is just another way of picturing what I've been saying, is if you're deep in core and you throw an exception, that it's going to unwind the stack all the way up, and up here in the input handler, it can then communicate the error to the user, and the user maybe can give you a new input structure or a new input file of some sort. So this is sort of the canonical way of how exceptions should be used in Rosetta. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the facility within the Java distributor, the JD2 Java distributor, for handling bad structures. So there's this idea of a mover status. So when in addition to the virtual functions that you've implemented, the pure virtual ones, the get name and the apply, there are other virtual methods in mover that have some support for indicating the state that it was left in when it finished. So there's an enum called mover status, which can either be a success, fail, but perhaps retry it for whatever reason. Say you try to close the loop and the loop didn't close for whatever reason. You could say, well, I want a closed loop at the end of the day. I know it wasn't like a logical error. It's just that for whatever reason I couldn't sample a closed loop. But it's a random algorithm, so let's try. If I try it again, there's a chance that I might get it right. There's a fail and do not retry. Like for instance, if it can determine that the loop can never possibly be closed because just for geometric reasons, then it can say, please don't retry this. Let's move on to the next input structure. And then there's fail bad input. If it can actually detect that there's bad input, but it doesn't particularly know what the input was, then don't retry any of the other structures and let the user know that there was bad input. So once the mover returns, the job distributor, or say if inside of the mover there was an exception thrown, if there was something that was a bad input exception, then that would end up having the same behavior as fail bad input. If there's anything else, then it ends up with an exception base, and that's a fail do not retry. So it's going to retry, it's going to move on to the next structure if the job distributor is able to catch an exception. So this is some facility for running over the whole PDB and detecting and handling bad structures. So there's this get last mover status function, which you can overload in a mover to specify this if you want. Okay, I'm going to transition a little bit from exception handling to how we use MPI clusters. So MPI stands for Message Passing Interface, and this is a very standard protocol for allowing software to run on separate nodes and communicate amongst each other. So the MPI library is wrapped up into some helper functions in the MPI util. So if you're going to interact with MPI, then there are a number of functions of this form. So for instance, you can ask in the middle of your execution, what is my MPI rank? And if you're the head node, or the number one, then it will say number one. And if you're the 750th slave node, then it will say 751. So what this allows you to do is in the middle of your code, you can have logic that says, if I'm the head node, then execute this block of code. If I'm not the head node, then execute this other block of code. So it allows different behavior to execute depending on which node that you are. And if you want to know how many cores there actually are, then this is the nproc. So if you're executing different code, one thing that you may want to do is to communicate information from where you are to some other node. So, so for instance, you can send a string to a node. And I haven't given the specification here, but basically you give it a string and you tell it which node to send it to. And then it will sit there and wait until the message has been received. So then there is some other node that is going to call receive node from string. And so it's going to sit there and wait until it receives information. And then once it's received the information, then both of them will continue on. And so there's a number of functions like this, and there's subtle things of trying to synchronize and other issues, which there are some helper functions for here. I'm not going writing parallel code is challenging because you have different points of execution that are going through this, and they can get the synchronization of them and making sure they're all going to work in a coherent fashion is tricky. So a common problem is that they get out of sync, or they get deadlocked, or there's race conditions. So this is it's important to take advantage of the computational resources, but there is challenging code to write. So there are some aspects of Rosetta, such as the job distributor, that's going to take advantage of this, and there's some specific protocols that take advantage of this. But just be aware that there is facility to run jobs on MPI clusters using this. Okay, so if you want to use MPI, then the standard way to do this is when you're compiling with scons is to add extras MPI to the command line. On our cluster, there are paths that correspond to where the MPI libraries live on the cluster. And if you compile Ubuntu, I don't think you need to do anything. They're just in the standard place. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
Okay. But then when you go to run it, you say MPI run, and then you say the number of cores that you would like to run, and then it adds, since it's an extras, this .mpi in the name of in the platform. I just want to draw your attention to the message passing interface way of doing parallel execution is separate than multi-threaded execution. So in computers, there's this notion of a thread, and a thread is sort of one execution. So it has it's going to execute this line and this line and this line and so on. In multi-threaded, it groups a number of executions, but it uses a shared block of memory. And so you can write to memory, and then another thread can read from the memory, and this is a way that you can communicate information between it. These are grouped together and called a process, and so they're all handled together by the operating system. A message passing interface is they're in separate processes, so they don't share any memory together, and they can be run on different nodes and communicate through infrastructure that's used to connect the nodes together. So it's much looser coupling of the processes, and they can't share information. So like for instance, if you're doing -N8, it's going to load 8 versions of the Rosetta database and 8 versions of the Dunbrack library, because each one will get their own copy of it. We're just communicating through message passing. It's not like we're sharing the same version of the Dunbrack library. So in some ways, this makes it trickier because you have less information. But in some ways, writing the code is easier because you know that no other thread is going to be reading and writing to the same memory block that you're going to be writing to. So like, for instance, when you allocate something on a heap, if you're in a multi-threaded situation, then something else could be modifying that particular block. Okay. The way that MPI is used in job distribution is there's different subclasses of the base job distributor that implement different strategies for handling the computational resources. So the most basic one is the work partition job distributor. And what that does is says if we have, say, 10 nodes, then we're going to assign, and we have, say, 100 input structures. Let's assign the first 10 input structures to the first node, the second 10 to the second node, and so on. And basically, there's no communication after that. They run independently, and they're going to finish, and then when they're all done, the run is done. So this is simple if you're running with just a few nodes, say 10, there's no overhead. All of the nodes are working at doing simulations. A more sophisticated version is called the work pool job distributor. And in this case, we have one head node that's not doing any simulations. It's managing the jobs to the slave nodes. So let's say we had 1,000 jobs. Then we would each worker node would say, "Hey, head node, I'm ready to work. Please give me a structure." And the head node says, "Okay, here is the structure that you should use. Go off and do your simulation and let me know when you're done." And the slave node says, "Great, thanks," and goes off and does the work and comes back. So in this case, the one head node isn't doing work. It's just handing out structures to the worker nodes, and the worker nodes are asking for structures when they're ready. So this, in some ways, makes better use of the computational resources, because let's say if there was an unequal distribution of work, say some structures took much longer to run than others, then it wouldn't wait around for them to finish. It wastes one head node, but as you scale up, that one is just a constant, whereas if you're scaling up, it gets bigger. So this head node isn't such a big deal when, say, you have 1,000 cores. It makes much more sense to take advantage of being able to schedule them better. Okay, so another version of the job distributor is the FileBuff job distributor. And here we have one head node, but instead of each worker node doing the output to the database or to the file system or the database itself, it communicates the structure to the output node, and the output node writes directly to the file system. One of the nice parts about this is that file systems are somewhat fragile, and if you, say, have 1,000 nodes that are all trying to write to the file system at once, this can overload the file system and cause problems for the rest of the people trying to use the cluster. There's been reported cases of bringing down a whole cluster, and especially if this is a shared resource, it can be bad. So if you have one node that's doing the input and output, then it can do it in some ways more efficient, more streamlined way, and less painful to the file system. So in this case, splitting the job responsibility to have one head node and one output node means that the head node can do its processing, and the output can just be responsible for outputting it. So if we try to do the output on the head node, then perhaps too much time would pass between writing out the structure and all the worker nodes are saying, "Come on, give me more structures to work on," and they would be waiting for the head node. So in particular, as you scale up past 1,000, distributing the work of what the head node could do becomes more important. So one job distributor called the archived job distributor is even more sophisticated. This has one head node, one output node, and one analysis node. And so in this case, this is doing more work than simply a single embarrassingly parallel execution per input structure or per job. It's going to do some aggregation or clustering or maintaining an archive of the top scoring decoys that you've seen so far. This needs to be integrated with a specific protocol, I believe. I haven't gotten this to work. Oliver wrote it. There's a paper published on it. I'll show you next sort of a graphical description of it. So it's complicated code that if this is something that you particularly need and you read the paper and it looks good, then consider using it. I'm showing you here because this is a strategy of using more head nodes to do more sophisticated job distribution. To scale it even further, there's a work unit manager, which is separate from the job distributor. The work unit manager if you have so many nodes that one head node can't keep up with all the worker nodes, then it's best to distribute the responsibility to lots of head nodes. So in this case, it has a hierarchy of nodes where there's one emperor node, 100 master nodes, and say 10,000 worker nodes. So this is becoming sort of like ancient Egypt with the pharaohs or so. As you scale up to more and more nodes, it's important to sort of scale the resources that you spend for job distribution accordingly. This isn't through the job distributor itself. It's through a program called the Work Unit Manager, which I'll show you a little bit in a second. Okay, so the archive job distributor has this figure in the paper, and I can identify the parts in this document, and I can show you where the code is, but I I can't tell you much more about that. So the job distributor is going to communicate with his archive manager, which is going to keep track of, say, the best decoys or a representative set of decoys. And then it's going to communicate with the MPI file buff job distributor, which is this one node that's going to be writing to the file system. And then there's a bunch of worker nodes. So the worker nodes are going to get the job from the job distributor. This is the head node. And then when it's done, it's going to communicate the structure to the MPI file buff, which is then going to write it to the file system. And this is going to go into the file system in some place called the archive. And then the archive manager is going to tell the job distributor about which jobs to pursue. And then eventually they're going to output the structures again to the file system. So Oliver and David wrote a recent paper on this to do NMR structure validation. I guess this is through Chemical Shift Rosetta, sort of CS Rosetta, and I think their protocol is called RASREC, but that's all I know of this. Okay, so this is from the work unit manager, Mike Taika, Ken Jung, and David Baker recently published this protocol, and they were using this on Google's resources. So they were able to test this, scaling it to an incredible amount. So as the computer clusters get bigger and the number of nodes increase, then you can watch how the performance degrades in the sense of are the work that you do as overhead dominating the work that you're doing to actually get work done. So what you would like to do is use, if you run twice as many cores, you would like to get twice as much done. But you have to use some amount of those cores to for this job distribution. And what you'd like is not to be too much overhead. It's sort of like a nonprofit spends all its money doing marketing. It's like you want to have the work being done to get stuff done. Okay, so this is the emperor node communicates with the master nodes and with the slave nodes. There's this whole complicated system of taking work as a work unit, performing the work unit, and then passing it back up, and then doing more with it. Key part of this is this idea of serialization. So if you have some data, being able to turn it into a string, and then pass the string over some communication, and then reconstruct the object from that. So this is a goal. It's a long-term big project in Rosetta, is to make data serializable, so that way you can communicate it between different nodes. So there is some support for this, but there's a long way to go to make it work. Okay. Okay, so additionally, the job distributor has a facility for evaluators. This is another piece of code by Oliver. I'll mention it in case you find it useful. I'll talk about tomorrow another way of getting out structural information, but this is built into the job distributor, and it has these variety of evaluators which add information to a silent file. So it's directly tied in with a silent file format, probably in with the MPI file buff job distributor, and it allows you to add additional information. So you can tell that it has chemical shift information and RMSD and some other things that were used for a particular exercise. But perhaps this is an architecture that works for your use case, and so you may want to extend it or take advantage of it. So it's good to know that it's here. Okay, this ends what I want to say about job distribution, and I'm going to go to the second part of what I'm going to talk about for Rosetta scripts. Okay, so Rosetta scripts was developed primarily by Sorel Fleshman in the Baker Lab, who's now back in Israel. Gideon, you're in Sorel's lab, right? No. Yeah. So there was a PLOS One paper that describes some of the details of this, and so it's worth reading if you want to know more details. But this is the in the one slide view of why it's useful to use Rosetta scripts. So rather than writing an application, which on the first day you have to figure out how to set up the job distributor and configure a mover or to do many things, to make using the components of Rosetta more accessible, they've defined an XML format for specifying protocols. One of the nicest parts about this is that you can change up your protocols without recompiling Rosetta. So you can get a precompiled version, specify the protocol in an XML script, hand it to Rosetta, and it will run your protocol. So the Rosetta scripts is pretty rigid, but it actually supports a fair amount of functionality. So it has these special sections. The first is the score function section. So you define a score function with a tag here. So for instance, this is describing the interface score function with the interface weights. Then there's a filter section, a mover section, and a protocol section. The protocol section is going to add filters and movers and execute them sequentially. So this is, it's going to use the job distributor, the JDQ job distributor, to create a sequence of movers and just apply one after the other as the pose moves through them, and then it's going to finish. So in some sense, it's just a way of creating a fancy mover that's going to be handed to the job distributor. Okay, so in this case, we're going to add a mover named doc, and the doc mover is defined in the mover section. The docking is the class name of the mover, and the doc here is this identifier, which is going to get called later. These parameters are passed to the parseMyTag function, which I'll describe next, and I think we might have seen this in the exercises if you've gotten to it. But the basic idea is that it's going to configure the class, or the instance, of a docking class with these parameters, and then when it's applied, it's going to apply that mover. Some movers take a filter which it knows how to use. So a filter is a facility where it evaluates something and returns either true or false. So for instance, the DGG filter specifies is there a cutoff for the delta G of mutation. So there's a wide number of the movers and filters, and there's another section, task operations, which specify as files and for the packer that are used to define a diversity of protocols. And quite a number of papers that use Rosetta use this framework. So it's well used and well supported. And I recommend it if you're starting to write a protocol to support Rosetta scripts, because then it will help your users use your code. Okay, so I just want to point out that although documentation for Rosetta is spotty, the documentation for Rosetta scripts is some of the best documentation we have. So I highly recommend taking a look at the Rosetta Wiki. You can get at it from the front page, and it lists all the movers, the filters, and task operations, and it has some developer guides and some other stuff. So this is a great place to find stuff about what movers are available and how they're used and things like that. So also, this on the other side, if you're going to write a mover that's going to be used by Rosetta scripts, then please add it to this documentation to keep it up to date. Okay, to run Rosetta scripts, you run the Rosetta scripts app, and it has the platform information, and you use your standard job distributor flags, and then you pass in this additional flag, parser protocol, and this is the file name of the XML script that you wanted to run. And it's going to run that script for each of the jobs. So if you have nstruct1, then for each of the input structures, or if you have nstruct 100, 100 times for each of the input structures. Okay, I'm going to now go through how, if you want to make your mover handle to be compatible with the Rosetta scripts. This was the evening exercise of the first day, which I'm not sure everybody got to, but perhaps if you want to go back to your lab, or if you want to make your mover compatible, you can look at that exercise and also look through these slides. So the main point is that there's this one function, parseMyTag, which is a virtual function in the mover base class, which you can overload in your derived mover. And it has this complicated things that it takes in. And I'm going to go through each of these one by one. So there's a few other virtual functions which you need to implement in order to use with Rosetta scripts. And that's fresh instance, which creates a whole new version of your mover and returns a pointer to it. Also, clone function clones its current state. So fresh instance and clone are sort of, this is, fresh instance gives you a new version, and the clone gives you the current version with like a deep copy. Okay, okay. So the first part So for this parse my tag, it takes in a tag pointer, a data map, a filter map, a mover map, and a pose. So this is parsed before it does any of the application of it. So in the mover apply function, this is in the middle of the protocol stepping through it. In the parse my tag, you get a pose before it's seen any of the application in the movers. So you're allowed to use the pose to, say, read the number of residues that it has and things like that. Okay, so for the tag, a tag is a data structure that represents an XML document. It has a number of member functions, which will be useful. So getName gets out the tag name for the outermost tag. HasOption gets back the key for a key value pair inside of the tag. And to use this, once this returns a bool to get back the value of the option. So this is the value for the option. You call the getOption function. So this is a template function, and we haven't talked about templates so much, so I just want to take a sec to talk about this. So what you would do to call this is call getOption with a string, which is the key, and then a default value for whatever it is that you want back. So let's say you wanted back a string. So you would specify in square brackets before the function call that it's a string, and that means that t is going to represent a string, and then you're going to give a default string of say value not specified or something like this. So if the option wasn't specified in the XML document, it still has something that it can use. Another function that is useful in the tag is get tags. This is going to get the subtags of the tag that you're currently in. So if you recall what from the XML format, in the filters, if you said get tags, it will return a vector of tags, one for each of the subtags. And them in themselves could have subtags and so on. So this gives a tree structure that represents all of the tags in the document. Okay, so to go through these different functions and how they're used. So getName is going to return SASA if this was the tag for the tag pointer. So you would call in the middle of parse my tag, you would call tag getName, and it would return a string of SASA in this case. GetOption, this is what we saw before, is going to say if you have confidence equal 0.5 in this tag, then it's going to be a real number. So we say tag getOption real, and this is the square brackets, and then the tag or the key that is confidence, because that's the one we want, and the default value is going to be 1. So we're going to assign that value to the confidence variable, which is real. Makes sense? Okay, the getTags function, this is vector 1. So to iterate across the tags in the vector, sorry, it's a vector 0. So to iterate across them, we do tags, get tags, which is the vector 0 dot begin is the beginning, and then get tags end, which is going to be the end of the vector. So this is the standard way of interacting with a vector 1 of somethings. And so this defines two constant iterators, t and t end. And then if we use a for loop where we iterate from while t is not equal to tn, and we increment t. So inside of this loop, we can dereference the constant iterator to point at the tag pointer at that position in the vector. So we can get the subtag as a tag pointer itself, and now we can parse it in the same way that we would parse the outer tag. So we can do this all within parse my tag. So in particular, if you have mover that takes a lot of initialization information, then you can specify to your user that in order to use this, they have to specify subtags, and you can have different types of subtags, and they can have information. So you're allowed to specify subtags in defining your mover or your task operations or filter, and then this is how you would go about parsing them. Okay, so in particular, if you had outer tag, then inner tag 1, inner tag 2, you would iterate across inner tag 1 and inner tag 2. Okay, so I just want to draw your attention to the fact that if you're initializing your mover with a parseMyTag, that there are lots of ways to initialize a mover. So you can initialize it through a constructor, through accessor functions, which may or may not read from the option system, parseMyTag, or otherwise. So it's important that when you're developing your application, that if you think of your thing, okay, this is going to be used within Rosetta scripts, that you don't preclude somebody from using your code, say if they do want to put it into an application. So somebody else may want to use your mover from code. So if they have to use parseMyTag in order to construct their object, then it basically won't be able to be used because they'll have to create a tag object somehow and then pass that in to parseMyTag. So if it's used in C++ or if you're using it directly from PyRosetta, say, then you still want to be able to use your mover to do some functionality. If you're specifying it from the command line, then you want to be able to initialize it using the option system. But if you're doing it in Rosetta scripts, where you have maybe multiple things, then passing in options from the option system may collide, and so you may not be able to pass the options in from the option system. So it's important to make sure that if you think of your mover or your object that you're creating is having some sort of specific functionality that's very clear, and then in order to initialize it, these specific things need to happen, that you give multiple ways of initializing an object. So either through the constructor or through these other methods. So don't force any one way to initialize your object. You'll get more use out of it, and people will use your code and cite you. Okay, so there's in the parseMyTag, there were other components. In particular, there was the data map. So rather than going into exactly what the data map is, at this level, I'd just like to tell you one way or two ways that you can use the data map. In protocols Rosetta Scripts util, there are functions. One of them is get task operations. And what you do here is you pass in a tag pointer and a data map, and it hands you back a vector1 of fully constructed task operations. So these task operations are going to be the ones that were defined in the task section. Or if you're going to do parse score function, you hand it a tag, a data map, and then a string, say the one with the specific tag in it. So if you recall, back in the original first part, it defined the interface weights here, and in the score function option for the alanine scanning, I had interface. So this is going to be a string when we try to use the get option, and we take this string and then we hand it to this function with the data map that we got in from the parseMyTag, and it gives us back the actual score function. So we would hand in interface, and this data map we're just handing on. We haven't really done anything with it to this parse score function, and it hands us back a fully constructed score function. So in this sense, you can think of the tag object or the tag pointer as being the key part that you're going to parse, and that other part is state that you may be able to, of the rest of the document, that you can pass on to other functionality to get back fully constructed objects. So these functions are in util, and if you want to dig into how they work, you can see exactly where the data map is used if you want to, say, store something else in the data map. Okay, if you can read this, this is an example of how to specify move maps using Rosetta scripts. So the first time you define a move map, say inside of the tag of a mover, you give it a name, and then you specify in these subtags, say, chains or residues or other levels of specifying a move map. Then if you wanted to define another mover, if you specify the same name to it, it will retrieve the move map that you had defined before. So this allows you to reuse the move map from above. Excuse me. So to do this, there's this parse move map function, which takes in a tag pointer, a particular pose, because in order to construct a move map, you need to know what a pose is. So this could use the pose from the parse my tag, for instance. And a reference to a move map and a reference to the data map. The reason why these are both references and not const references is that it doesn't know ahead of time if it's the first time that it's seen it. So if it's the first time that it's seen it, then it's just going to populate the move map and also then populate the data map. But if it's the second time that it's seen it, then the data map isn't going to change, and it's just going to populate the move map. There's a caveat here in that if in your protocol you're changing the degrees of freedom, or it makes throughout the protocol, then initializing the move map with the pose at parse time isn't the pose that you actually want to make the move map of. So if you're doing design or something like that. So I think this is a tricky aspect, and I just wanted to make you aware of this, that for instance, FastRelax parses the move maps at runtime, not at parse time. So there's some subtle complexity here, so just be aware of them. Okay, just one or two more slides on how to parse Rosetta scripts. There's another one called parse filters and parse mover. And this, you pass in the move map and the filter map, and it gives you back a filter or a mover. And again, these are all in the util function. Okay, so that concludes what I want to tell you about Rosetta scripts. I recommend using them, and I think it's a good system, even if the protocol is somewhat linear. You just go through it. But there are movers that say loop mover or if mover. So there is some basic functionality for having sort of multi-state or multi-workflow applications. There is a way to save a pose up above and then get the pose back. So in some sense, you can have variables, but it's still somewhat limited. There was initial work to make Lua scripts, which then would be a more sophisticated version of Rosetta scripts, but that isn't off the ground yet. One of the things you might think, well, what if we do PyRosetta, why can't we just use PyRosetta to do something like this? And I just want to take this opportunity to say that C++, in this case, is where you're executing the program. It's a C++ application. And so if we had Rosetta scripts, or if we had Lua, then that would be an embedded language into it. So it would, in some sense, C++ would be the master or the driver. In PyRosetta, Python is it's an extension language. So in that case, it is the driver, and you're in the Python evaluation loop, and it's going to be calling functions inside of C++. So there's this difference between an extended language and an embedded language. And to extend on Rosetta scripts to something like Lua, you would need to do it in an embedded language. And Python is very difficult to embed.
Is that ask a question about tags?
Yes.
So both this like DBs have all the structures, all the decoys have tags, but then also things like RMSD have tags. I'm just confused with that.
RMSD has a tag.
Like the different features have tags too.
Yeah. We'll bring this up tomorrow when we talk about the database stuff, which I think is where you're getting at. So I can tell you, as far as GD2 is concerned, each job has an input tag and an output tag, and you can ask the job distributor for that. For Rosetta scripts, the tag system is separate from the job distributor, and those are defined within the Rosetta scripts, and you can use these functions that I showed you to access the other parts of the script. In the tag pointer here, the sys tag is different than the tag for the input structure tag. That's an overloaded word. Okay, so the job distributor and this parallelization to multi-cores is primarily about getting an input structure to the execution of Rosetta. In the beginning, I mentioned that part of the challenge is not just the input structure, but all of the accompanying information that you may want to run the application. The parameters, experimental data, user-defined constraints, and so on, res files, and things like that. So here I'm going to tell you about another architecture that is related to job distribution is in the process of being developed to handle data to get it as part of the execution of a run. So so here I'm going to transition to another presentation. How are we doing on time?
About 10 minutes past.
And now I'm going to start the third part of my talk. Should I get into this? Do you want me to do the real quick version? The 2-slide version? Great. Okay, here's slide number 1. No. This is, I think, the key slide to show you. Okay, so the basic idea of a resource is that the resource manager will be able to hang on to data that is either expensive or complicated to initialize. So how does data get into the resource manager? It comes from a data store. So you can think of this as a generalization of a file system. So it could be a file system, it could be a relational database, it could be a whole set of silent structures. From this, the data is essentially a key value map. The key is some identifier, and the value is going to be some serialized version of the data. So a PDB file, a silent file, or something else. So from this, the resource is, the data store is identified by a resource locator, which is specific for the data store type. So the file system resource locator, you give it a file name, and it gives you back the contents of the file. The database resource locator, you give it a query, and it gives you back the value of a cell from a query. So from a serialized version, so like an iStream of the data, it hands it to a resource loader. So for instance, a PDB resource loader would get a stream of a PDB and a whole set of options, as resource options, and know how to construct a PDB file. Once the PDB file is turned into a pose, it's handed to the resource manager and hung onto associated with an identifier. Then the protocols can ask the resource manager, please give me the pose that is associated with native. And it can give back the native pose, rather than having the protocol try to parse the PDB and read it out of the filing system, or read it out of the silent structure, and so on. So it relieves the responsibility of the protocol for knowing how to interact with different types of data stores, how to configure a particular resource, and all it gets is a fully constructed object. Additionally, the resource manager is responsible for handling in command line options, and it does this because the option system is static. It represents what was on the command line. But the resource manager can hand out the options to the protocols in ways that the resource manager knows is more intelligent. So in particular, the resource manager is aware of, interacts with the job distributor, and can hand different resources to the protocol depending on which part of the job distribution stage they're in. So the native structure is a key example in that when you ask for the native structure, what you want is the native structure associated with your particular simulation. If you pass in the native structure here, then every execution is going to have to use the same native structure. If you load the native structure once per simulation, then you're going to have to reload the same native structure, say, for each end struct. So instead, if you have, say, some simulations are going to be with one scaffold, and some simulations are going to be with a different scaffold, you could load the PDBs associated with the native structure for each of the scaffolds, and then the protocols, when they ask for them, can give back the appropriate native structure. So this is a framework which I can go into more detail if you're interested about how to handle resources. So PDBs, electron density maps, symmetry definition files are all implemented so far. There's the loop hash databases if you're doing loop hash. and so on. And we're expanding the list of the resources that are being handled by the job distributor and making sure that the protocols are asking the resource manager for the option system, for the options rather than asking the option system directly. So this is, it's working, but it's not fully deployed. But be aware of this when you get to the point in your simulation where you go, wow, the option system is really limiting. How do I get resources into my protocol? Do I have to run them as separate executions each time? Look at the resource manager, and there's documentation online. Okay, thanks for that. And I think I am done, so thank you for listening.